when organizations look at risk, they've got to look at a number of things. They've got to look at human risk, they've got to look at technological risks, they've got to look at environmental risks. What are my neighbors doing? What, if there was an issue next door, would that have a material impact on my organization? So I think you've got to have a balanced scorecard. You've got to look at what risks could affect your organization, score those, and then talk about, or at least start to plan some mitigation strategy around those. So I'm a big proponent of scoring these. And you could even do it in a rudimentary level, high, medium, low, something along those lines. But you want to make sure that you bubble up the most important risks and then wrap some mitigation strategies around that, or at least acknowledge that risk is present, and then maybe put a plan in place to overcome that risk if possible.
Well, when performing a risk assessment, I think the key thing is to keep it simple. I've been at this great conference here already today, and in one of the breakout sessions I've heard of questionnaires that are about 400 questions in length. Things like that will not get the right attention. So what we tend to do is combine our risk assessment with a business impact analysis, because most of the people that are engaged in business continuity in most organizations don't do this full time. And if you have an opportunity to get their attention and you combine the risk assessment with what are the critical processes, that kind of helps.
Well, risk assessment is one of those processes, one of the tools for the business continuity professional that I think has been evolving over the years. If you look back 10, 20 years ago, one of the things that we did that wasn't very value adding was just inventorying threats. What possibly could create the interruption? What's the likelihood, the possible severity if that occurred? And we typically used to multiply severity times likelihood, and we'd have this inventory. But executive managers came back to us and said, that's not really valuable. I want to understand the business risk. What are the controls we have in place, regardless of cause, and how can I improve those controls? So the roadblocks or the issues that we face that we continue to have to overcome is avoiding analysis paralysis, not getting in just the constant statistical analysis to the point where we constantly study, but we don't really present the outcomes and the recommendations. And again, as I mentioned, not necessarily leading with or focusing on the threat, but let's focus on the business risk. Let's talk about the cost-benefit analysis of implementing an appropriate control. And then from there, move on to understanding the implications of what's left from a residual risk perspective and build plans accordingly.
Risk assessment, a risk analysis has a number of different meanings for many companies. It could be as focused as a technology data center, DR, ICT type risk. It could be a location-based risk assessment or proximity risks or larger risks to the business. What I found more productive, similar to some of the standards, is using newer standards like ISO 31000. Puts a better structure on delivery and content for the customer and consistency of deliverables of the value. And that's kind of an evolution away from the best practices and some things that have been developed over the last decade, which still need to be considered and integrated. But if it's a standard-based approach, it gives you consistency, repeatability, and sustainability.
As it relates to doing a risk assessment, a lot of times people are solely focused on what happens if the computers go down, and trying to broaden their view to say what happens if there's a supplier outage, what happens if we lose a facility, what happens if potentially a logistics component goes down, maybe a distribution center or a warehouse, maybe a port of entry for products coming in. So getting them to broaden their view of what a risk is, it's not just a loss of computer systems, is key. Also getting them to understand that we're talking about, with business continuity, generally a longer term impact. We're not concerned about we lost power for 30 minutes and then the power comes back down, or the computers had a problem and they're back up. Because those kinds of things tend to happen on a regular basis, unfortunately, but people just expect that those are going to be handled. So getting them to understand that a longer-term outage can have broader-based impacts on the organization. from a scoring point of view, I think it's important to not just have a one-size-fits-all issue. There may be different weighting that you have to apply to scores based on different kinds of impacts that occur. So I think setting up the scoring algorithm, ahead of time, factoring in, the kinds of risks that exist, the potential impacts of those risks, so that you get a fairly normalized set of scoring, so that you can do some prioritization. If you can't normalize the scoring, you can't prioritize.